whether Canadian politics is going to polarize like U.S. politics, that's such a tough question. It's like the $10,000 question right now.
An election campaign is now officially underway in Ontario. Lots of us already know who we're going to vote for, but lots of us don't. As party leaders spend the next few weeks making commitments and appealing to our values, how likely are big headlines drifting in from the U.S. to have an impact on how we choose our political representatives?
Well, I think to some extent they certainly do, and I think that's just a product of the U.S. media saturation in Canada.
The first most obvious example would be news out of the United States surrounding the Supreme Court. Are we expecting that these developments will be something that sway Ontario voters?
I don't think it will be a factor, and I think part of the reason is that there's a pretty strong consensus around the protection of abortion rights, pretty much right across the political spectrum, in Canada as a whole, but also in Ontario.
Disney. This was a big one. There was debate over what role corporations should have in the public discourse, as well as what goes into your child's curriculum. It was hotly debated in the States. It still is. Is this something Ontarians will be considering as well?
I think these are issues that are a little bit more of an overlap. But again, I think not the same kind of polarization as we see in the U.S. I think one of the big polarizing issues in the U.S. was the impact of, or the so-called impact of critical race theory in elementary and secondary education. It's potentially a really powerful wedge issue. Again, despite the issues of racial inequality, in a place like Ontario, I think our history is just fundamentally different than American history, which means that issue won't play out exactly the same way. I do think that there's a little bit more overlap, say, in sex ed and teaching about gender and sexuality. I know that these were some issues that came up in the last Ontario provincial election.
Inflation, both sides of the border. Is this going to be front and center for a lot of people, affordability at home?
I certainly think it is. I certainly think that to the extent that I'm aware of the issues that are developing to be at the center of the provincial election, it's bread and butter issues. It's bread and butter issues like the cost of living, like highway expansion, like Metrolink expansion.
Meanwhile,
like
if we take COVID, is this a driving factor still for people, or is this in the rear view?
Yeah, it's surprising. My just impression, just anecdotally, is that it's a lot less of a concern, especially after the most recent surges of Omicron, which it seems as if everyone knows has gotten it. I think it's absolutely still a major public health issue.
Is our electorate splitting into two groups, kind of identifiable as either woke or MAGA? Are we getting polarized in that sense here in Ontario?
Well, I think if we do, it's because we're consuming a lot of U.S. news. Because to the extent that we think that Ontario is some kind of carbon copy of the United States that has exactly the same issues and exactly the same history, we're very much preparing ourselves to go down that route. We're not paying attention to the actual conditions on the ground here, which I think are very, very different.
The 2022 Ontario general election will be held on June the 2nd. For City News, I'm David Zura.